the University of Wisconsin, where he is a postdoctoral researcher and scholar. And his research combines chemical ecology and forest entomology and shows how these interactions shape landscape level outcomes of insects and trees. He's currently studying mountain pine beetles in historical and semi-nipe host trees, and looking at how tree defenses across these host trees affect the bark beetle's behaviors. He's also an outdoorsman like many of us, loves to hike, ski. Do you bike, Mike?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
And bike. There you go. So yeah, feel free to chat with him afterwards. And I'm going to hand it over to you. And let's get started.
All right. Thank you, Sneha, for that wonderful introduction. So today I'm going to be talking about 4 stories about eruptive bark beetles and some lessons that we've learned from working at both stand and landscape levels. So eruptive insects are those that undergo intermittent outbreaks, cause large-scale tree mortality, which can ultimately disrupt ecosystem dynamics. These insects have been implicated in causing the most tree mortality globally, and their population dynamics tend to be governed by competing positive and negative feedbacks. But also importantly, these eruptions are variable in both their frequency and extent, which can make categorizing or describing their dynamics somewhat difficult. So we're starting an effort to reclassify different types of eruptive insects and develop a more unified framework so that we can describe these insects a little bit better. And so what I mean by this is we've worked on coming up with some different classifications. So the first are those insects that are cyclical, and I'll explain these in a second. Those that are pulse driven, and those that are threshold limited. Okay, so as I have alluded to, this work is just beginning, but eventually we would like to determine what drives eruptions and describe eruptive dynamics. This is especially important in a changing world, as some insects might have eruptive dynamics, but because the areas that they impact are relatively low, we might think that they don't have as much eruptive potential. And so being able to better describe these will give us better tools to predict which ones might undergo more severe or more frequent outbreaks in a warming and changing climate. Okay, so I quickly introduced the terms. So now what do I mean by these different categories? So the first are those insects that undergo regular cyclical outbreaks. One of the best examples is the larch bud moth. These insects undergo regular outbreak cycles that occur regardless of what the climatic conditions are like. Secondly, we have pulse-driven species, and these include things like western balsam bark beetle up top here, and spruce beetle in some places on the bottom here. And we like to define these as insects that erupt in response to an increase in host resources. And so another good example might be the pinyon eps, where populations build up rapidly in response to drought or warming temperatures. And then finally, we have our threshold limited species, and we don't have that many examples of these types of insects, which is a good thing. But really the flagship is mountain pine beetle, where there are density dependent changes in their reproduction and potential for spread, and they can breach these thresholds, which can lead to self-amplifying growth, and they can spread rapidly across large landscapes, killing almost all suitable trees. Okay, so I've started to intimate that I'll be talking about bark beetles. So let's just quickly talk about bark beetle population dynamics and population phases. So their dynamics are density dependent, where population growth rates depend on population size. And bark beetles typically exhibit 3 distinct population phases. So the first is their endemic stage, and this is where bark beetles spend most of their time. So during this phase, beetles are restricted to stressed and suppressed trees. However, if you have some event such as a blowdown or drought or an accumulation of suppressed trees, you can start to get a buildup of population, and beetles will transition to their incipient phase. During this phase, beetles can kill even some, or they can kill some healthy trees, but they're still usually restricted to smaller trees. However, if populations continue to grow, perhaps because of suitable landscape conditions, then they can breach their epidemic phase. And this is where they can cause landscape scale mortality. So some of the density dependent controls in this system include negative density dependent factors such as resource depletion. So beetles can only use a tree for a single generation, and then that tree is removed as a suitable resource from the landscape. Secondly, host defenses. So trees are equipped with strong allele resin defenses that beetles generally cannot overcome unless they are at high population densities. And then also natural enemies, which serve as a control more so for smaller populations. On the flip side, we also have some potential positive density dependent factors present in the system. So several beetle species will exhibit cooperative attack behavior, where they will undergo pheromone-mediated mass attacks. And these mass attacks allow beetles to overcome the tree defenses of even the most vigorous trees. And then this is also related to beetles being able to increase the host susceptibility through these types of attacks. So generally, we talk about beetles transitioning from their endemic to their epidemic phase when you have more positive density dependent than negative density dependent factors occurring in your system. Okay, so today I want to talk about 4 different stories focusing on pulse-driven and threshold-limited insects, with this ultimate goal of starting to get some benchmarks of what drives eruptions in these different groups. And so I'm going to start by talking about pine engravers in Wisconsin at the stand level, and then mountain pine beetle in British Columbia, also at the stand level. And then we're going to zoom out to the landscape and look at Western balsam bark beetle in British Columbia, and also wrap up with mountain pine beetle range expansion, again in British Columbia. Okay, so to begin with, we wanted to look at pine engravers in Wisconsin because these are one of the best examples of pulse-driven insects that we have locally. These insects cause periodic mortality in plantation settings, and their population dynamics tend to be regulated by bottom-up forces, which are often tree-mediated, and these trees can be compromised either through bioclimatic factors such as drought, or by root and lower stem insects such as Dendroctonus valens, Hylastes, or Hylobius. The latter 2 of these, which are both root or collar insects. And then we also have lateral forces in the system, such as intra and inter-guild competition. So competition within IPS where we have Ips grandicollis and Ips pini, and then also wood borers, which have the potential to steamroll over some of these pine engravers, because their larvae are just so big relative to Ips. And then finally, we have some top-down forces, which include a couple of predators. Okay, so we wanted to look at the populations of these different insects. And so we set up 9 sites and then set up 8 Lindgren funnel and pitfall traps per site. And then traps were checked every other week for 5 years. Okay, so I'm going to start by showing us just the mean trap catch data for these different groups of insects. So on top, we have the predators. In the middle, we have the pine engravers and wood borers. And in the bottom, we have the root and lower stem insects. And really the big takeaway here is that populations were fairly variable across the years of this study. For example, Ips pini were really high in 2004 and decreased over the time series of the study until 2008. We can also take that same data and look at it on a per generation basis. And I have this italicized because it's from a Ips perspective. Ips are multivoltine and will go through several generations per year. And we chose to pick 30 days to try and break our sampling periods roughly into months. Okay, so our goal here was whether we could explain the drivers of these beetles, and we wanted to do it on both the yearly basis, where we included these insects as their different guilds, so predators, lateral, and the bottom-up insects, and bioclimatic predictors. And then we also wanted to fit models on this per generation basis. And we did this by fitting GAMs with a response of the mean trap catch of the target insect. So for example, we fit separate models for Ips pini and Ips grandicollis. And then we included fixed effects of the mean trap catch from each one of those groups of insects, and then bioclimatic predictors for the yearly models, and then included cubic splines, or thin plate splines, sorry, for year, generation, site, and subsite. Okay, so I'm going to quickly walk us through what we found. So for modeling the number of Ips pini per year, I'm going to be showing just the direction of the slope from the GAM, and then the stars denote significance. And it's the R significance. So less than 0.05 is 1 star, less than 0.001 is 3 stars, for example. Okay, so what we found is that Ips pini are positively related to temperatures that are warmer than usual. We also see that they're negatively related to conditions that are wetter than usual, that we see here at the bottom with the minimum vapor pressure deficit. And really, I think what this correlates to is that they're positively related to conditions that are drier than usual. But some of these bioclimatic predictors are a little bit funky. And then when we look on a generation basis, we see that there's a positive relationship with the top-down, lateral, and bottom-up species, although with slightly different temporal legs, which I'm not going to go into right now, but I'd be happy to talk about later. But ultimately, it seems that our takeaway is that conditions that are good for Ips pini tend to be good for other species, and there doesn't seem to be much evidence of competition in this system. And we see a similar pattern for Ips grandicollis, where they're positively related to temperatures that are warmer than usual and positively related to conditions that are drier than usual. Relatedly, we also see that conditions that are good for Ips grandicollis are also good for others. And again, no evidence of competition. We also fit models for the bottom up and top down, but I'm not going to talk about those today. Okay, so what have we learned about pulse-driven insects? First, we have some evidence that pine engravers respond to warm temperatures and drought, which is exactly what we would expect. But we also don't seem to see much intra-guild competition here, although these are trap catch data, and trap catch data can be notoriously noisy. We also see that bottom up and top down forces are pretty weak, in at least with the resolution that we can look at this system with. And something that I didn't show you today, but would like to bring up, is that we also looked at whether there was a relationship between the number of dead trees and pine engravers and found no relationship. So again, trap catch data might be not the best way of assessing this system. Okay, so moving on to our second story. If we think about these three population phases of eruptive bark beetles, it turns out that we don't have a very good understanding of how beetles go from their endemic to their incipient phase, especially for threshold limited species. Part of the reason for this is that threshold limited outbreaks don't occur all that often. And so you have to be in the right place at the right time to be able to look at the dynamics. Okay, so we wanted to figure out how outbreaks start. So this was some work that was originally designed by Brian Akama when he was a postdoc. So for those of you that know Brian, recognize that this study happened a long time ago. And so he set up 6 sites with endemic populations of mountain pine beetle. And over the course of 6 years, they censused every single tree in these sites, which I did the math at one point, and it was around about 115,000 trees that they looked at almost on a monthly basis during the summer. And so during the census, they spatially referenced all attacks by bark beetles in these stands. So this data set was awesome, and it allowed us to look at how beetle reliance on prior stress agents, quality of selected hosts, and spatial distribution of attacks changes with local population density. Okay, so the first thing I want to show is beetle reliance on prior stressors. And by prior stressors, I mean disease, prior attack, or physical damage. And so the color scheme for this section will be black for mountain pine beetle, red for pulse-driven insects, which in this case are also Ips pini, and then yellow for lower stem insects. And then our x-axis for many of these figures will be the number of attacked trees per hectare, and the y-axis will be the proportion of attacked trees with prior stressors. Okay, so if we look at our first example, we see that mountain pine beetle reliance on prior stressed material decreases as population size increase. We see a similar pattern with Ips pini, although we don't see quite as strong an effect, and our predictor space, or where we have points in this figure, is pretty minimal compared to the mountain pine beetle. And so this effect is pretty weak, ultimately, we think. And then we see the opposite pattern for lower stem insects, where reliance increases with increasing population size, although this slope is, again, pretty weak. Okay, so then secondly, we can look at whether the quality of selected hosts change. So again, our x-axis is the attacked trees per hectare, and I'll be showing a selection of different y-axes, starting with diameter at breast height in centimeters. And so what we see is that mountain pine beetle attack larger trees as populations increase, whereas Ips pini attack smaller trees as populations increase. And I'm not showing the line for the lower stem insects because it was not significant. Secondly, we can look at their relationship to mean annual increment, or which is really a proxy for growth rate. And what we see is that mountain pine beetle also attack faster growing trees as populations increase. And lower stem insects attack slower growing trees, although that line is somewhat hard to see. And finally, we can look at the phloem thickness, and mountain pine beetle attack trees with thicker phloem as populations increase. This is notable because thicker phloem leads or is implicated in a higher per tree reproductive rate or replacement rate for beetles. And then we also wanted to look at what characteristics were broadly associated with these different types of insects using a PCA, and saw that population size, phloem thickness, DBH, and MAI were all associated with mountain pine beetle. But that's a slightly more esoteric point, so I'm not going to dig too deep into that. Okay, and then finally, we wanted to look at whether the spatial distribution of attacks change. And so we can start by just graphically looking at where attacks occurred within each stand over the course of 1999 to 2005. And we can then try to describe the pattern of attacks for each one of these insects. And the way that we do this is by starting with an observation. So in this top panel, and I'm just going to be showing an example from within this little gray insert. And we can then fit, or we can look at the density of observed attacks with these different, or with these three different null hypotheses, sigma equals 5, all the way up to sigma equals 50, which really is just different ways for thinking about scales of aggregation in this system. And then based on this density of observed attacks, we can construct a null hypothesis that states that attacks are randomly distributed based on a Poisson point process based on the observed density. And so you'll see in this set of panels the difference in the three different sigmas with our null hypotheses. And ultimately, we do this so that we can create, or we can compare our line, which is the function describing our observation, to an envelope, which is this gray area, which is constructed from 99 simulations of our null hypothesis. And the interpretation here is relatively simple. If the line is outside of the envelope, then it is significant. Okay, so I'm not going to go through all of the different curves here, but instead show our interpretation. So in this bottom area are those site by year combinations that did not undergo aggregation. And in the upper part are those that did undergo significant aggregation. And still, again, on our x-axis is the attacked trees per hectare. Okay, so if we start out, we see that at low population densities, we have no evidence of aggregation, which is denoted by either X's, where we just didn't have enough of a sample size, or by open circles. However, once populations began to build up, we get this transition from random to aggregated for mountain pine beetle but that doesn't seem to happen for our lower stem insects. So they are still more or less randomly distributed within stands, even at pretty high population densities. Okay, so we can also, after we discovered that there's a significant shift in the spatial distribution, we can then also look at what trees beetles are attacking. So the first thing I want to orient you to on these figures is that the lines or the dotted lines represent the average stand DBH, and the black lines are the function describing the spatial correlation of size of tree attacked. And so the interpretation here is that lines above the envelope are those that are significantly higher than the stand average. So the reason that this is interesting is we can use it to see that attacked trees that are larger than the stand average are spatially correlated in this panel A, B, and F. And the distance that they're correlated is around 5 to 15 meters, which happens to be about the same or about the effective distance of mountain pine beetles' aggregation pheromones. So really what we think we're seeing here is that mountain pine beetle aggregation is really facilitating beetles' ability to attack larger trees, which is pretty cool. Okay, so just to quickly wrap up this section, what did we learn here? Quite a few things. We see that there's a density-dependent shift in mountain pine beetle reliance on prior stress agents, quality of selected hosts, and the shift from random attacks to aggregated attacks, whereas we don't see similar patterns in either the pulse-driven or lower stem guilds. Secondly, we also have some evidence that these processes might be converging, where aggregation is really helping to facilitate the shift in quality of selected hosts and decrease reliance on prior stressors. Okay, so now that we've talked about these different sections, let's zoom out. Okay, so first we're going to talk about, or first I want to talk about Western balsam bark beetle in British Columbia. It turns out that we don't know we really don't know anything about this insect, which is actually pretty crazy because in the last 20 years, it's impacted an area in British Columbia that's second only to mountain pine beetle. And greater than things like Western spruce budworm, spruce beetle, and even fire. So we wanted to dig into some of the drivers here of this insect. So the first thing that we did was just plot where Western balsam bark beetle has occurred. And so this is the cumulative extent of Western balsam bark beetle, and we see that primarily activity is located in this north central part of BC. And if we look at the time series of when this activity occurred, we have a couple different increases, but most notably, we have this big increase starting in around 2011 to 2012, where we get this huge outbreak of Western balsam bark beetle. Okay, so since we don't know very much about this insect, we wanted to know where subalpine fir mortality occurred. We wanted to know what explains patterns of beetle activity, and then whether outbreaks are synchronous. In order to do this, we fit a couple of different random forests describing where and then when beetle activity happened. And I'm not going to talk about the methods here, but I'm happy to talk about them later. Okay, so to begin with, we wanted to know where Western balsam bark beetle occurs. And it turns out that the predictors that provide the best explanatory power or have the highest variable importance for this model are latitude by elevation. So this is latitude in meters multiplied by elevation in meters, and then Z standardized, followed by the volume of fur within 8 kilometers, but volume of fur greater than 100 years old. And then the third most important is the volume of fur within a given pixel, 1 kilometer squared pixel. It turns out that this model was able to correctly predict where Western balsam bark beetle occurred 97% of the time. And graphically, this is where our model predicted Western balsam bark beetle to occur, where in red, we have areas that had a prediction of higher than 0.8, all the way down to this very light red, where the probability was predicted to be between 0 and 0.2. Okay, so based on these different landscape susceptibility classes, we can then fit separate models to predict when Western balsam bark beetle occurred in these different areas. So to begin with, we can look at what explains when outbreaks occur in highly susceptible landscapes. And we see that the best predictor is the deviation in annual precipitation in year T-1, followed by mean climatic moisture index, or the mean deviation from year T-1 to T-3. And then third is the Palmer drought severity. So it seems to be that conditions that are drier and warmer than usual provide the best predictive power. And overall, this model correctly predicted 95% of when activity happened. So we can then do the same thing for the other predicted landscape susceptibility classes. And for the moderately high class, we see a pretty similar set of predictors where we have annual precipitation as the best predictor, followed by Palmer drought severity, and then also the beginning of frost-free period measured in days. And again, our true positive rate is pretty good here at 0.86. As we go to the moderately susceptible areas, our true positive rate, or the amount of power we have in our prediction, starts to go down, but we're still identifying a pretty similar set of predictors, and same with even the moderately low susceptible landscapes. Although drought was implicated as the most important predictor here, although again, the predictive power is pretty low. We didn't fit a model for the low susceptible because there were hardly any actual cases of mountain pine or of Western balsam bark beetle in those stands. Okay, and then finally, we wanted to look at the spatiotemporal dynamics of the system. So if we think about a hypothetical collection of time series where on the x-axis we have year, and on the y-axis we have severity. So this is just when and where activity occurred. We can use a couple different tools to describe these dynamics. So the first is that we can cluster these time series based on k-means clustering. And so, for example, we have this third cluster where activity happened later, and then the first and second where we have a little bit of or the first one where activity happened first, and then the gray is the second one. So the reason that this is useful is we can look at a hypothetical landscape and we can plot where these clusters occurred. And this allows us to describe the pattern of where these different time series clusters happened and determine whether they occur in discrete areas, which leads us to the conclusion that eruptions start independently, or whether we see evidence of a bullseye where eruptions spread from a starting point. So when we do this for Western balsam bark beetle, we see that beetle activity occurs in 3 distinct clusters. So we have this dark blue cluster that is small and somewhat hard to see, and then a green cluster, and then this red cluster. And these seem to be pretty, or the blue and the green seem to be pretty synchronous. And then the red seems to have sort of two peaks to it. And then areas in this lighter pink are areas where there was minimal activity throughout the time series. So just to give us an example of why we think that this is discrete and not bullseye, I can show the similar map for mountain pine beetle, where we have this really strong bullseye effect where beetle activity is rapidly spreading. Okay, and then the second way that we can describe these dynamics is by looking at the pairwise distance of these time series across our hypothetical landscape, where we can look at the distance and describe the correlation at increasing distance. And this allows us to look at something like stand scale or mesoscale synchrony in our populations. And so when we look at this for our current system, in this A panel is the area of mortality from Western balsam bark beetle. And what we see is strong evidence of local synchrony that decreases pretty rapidly after about 10 to 20 kilometers. Whereas for some of our bioclimatic drivers, such as Palmer drought severity, beginning of frost-free period, and mean annual temperature, these are all highly correlated at large distances. And so really this ultimately allows us to think about how these bioclimatic factors are contributing to the synchrony of these insect outbreaks. Okay, so what we saw with this analysis is that Western balsam bark beetle are found in places with more fur, which is a pretty good conclusion. We also saw that outbreaks are tied to increasing temperature and drought, and outbreaks are highly synchronous. Really, this work serves more as a jumping off point, though, and helps us come up with some more targeted questions to ask, since we don't know very much about this insect. Okay, and then finally, I'm going to transition into my final story, mountain pine beetle range expansion in British Columbia. So during the last 20 years or so, mountain pine beetle has started to move into whitebark pine, which is a keystone species that provides a food source for numerous animals and also helps regulate snowpack and hydrological cycles. And surprisingly, for a slow-growing tree-line species, is also early successional. Over the last 20 years, mountain pine beetle range expansion has impacted a little more than 50% of all 1 square kilometer areas with whitebark pine in BC. So because of this, and also because of an invasive fungal pathogen, white pine blister rust, it's estimated that we've lost more than 50% of all whitebark pine in both the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem and southern BC. Because of this, and because it's projected to increase, whitebark pine was listed as an endangered species in Canada in 2010, and it was just announced that it's up for review in the US at the end of last year. Okay, so because mountain pine beetle is expanding into whitebark pine, we wanted to know whether this was a result of emigration, where beetles would transition from their endemic to their epidemic phase within lodgepole pine and then expand upward in elevation due to host depletion of lodgepole pine, or whether beetles were exhibiting a new or whether beetles were able to transition from their endemic to their epidemic phase entirely within whitebark pine stands, which would be pretty bad in the context of this system. So in order to do this, we developed a spatiotemporal model at a 1 kilometer squared resolution from 2000 to 2019, where we're predicting the mountain pine beetle severity for each stand type. And by that, I mean lodgepole pine, which will be in green, mixed pine, which is lodgepole and whitebark pine in blue, and then finally pure whitebark pine stands in pink. So in order to develop this model, we created estimates of beetle population pressure, which is how much mountain pine beetle is in the landscape, which is a distance weighted sum. And we calculated this at both 5 kilometer and 1 kilometer scales. And then we also included a whole host of other predictors that we know are important in this system. So our ultimate goal after we compiled all of our data was to explore the spatiotemporal pattern of infestation, and then predict and explore the drivers of spread across lodgepole and then expansion into whitebark pine. Okay, so as I've already shown a little bit, mountain pine beetle activity in BC exhibits this strong bullseye pattern where activity or the outbreak was initiated in this central part of BC and spread rapidly throughout the province. And it turns out when we look at look at what areas were hit hardest, we see that stands that were attacked earlier were generally also had a greater severity of infestation. We can also look at the duration of infestation per grid cell, where on the x-axis is the number of years a single cell was infested, and on the y-axis is the proportion. And what we see is that most lodgepole pine was infested for 4 or 5 years, whereas most whitebark pine was only infested for 1 year. We also see that duration, the duration of infestation was positively related to the pine basal area of each individual pixel. We also see that duration is positively related to age, and duration is positively related to the number of stems per hectare. Okay, so ultimately we saw that mountain pine beetles spread rapidly across BC. Cumulative severity was higher in most areas infested earlier, and lodgepole pine was infested much longer than whitebark pine. We also see that duration of infestation was positively related to basal area, age, and density, which are all things that we know are good for mountain pine beetle. Okay, and then secondly, we wanted to explore these drivers of spread and expansion, and we fit this again using a random forest. This time we're using a random forest as a regression instead of a classification. And so this allows us to get a R squared instead of a true positive or true negative rate. And what we see is that our R squareds are quite high for each one of these models. Okay, so I'm going to walk us through the results of these pretty quickly. But what we see for the lodgepole pine specific model is that population pressure is the best predictor of mountain pine beetle severity, followed by mountain pine beetle climatic suitability. Bioclimatic factors don't seem to be all that important, at least in year T-1, but may be important in year T-0. And then also we have some evidence that stand characteristics and geographic information are important, but they're all dwarfed by population pressure. We see a pretty similar pattern in mixed stands, where again, population pressure is the best predictor and provides the best 3 variables for explanatory power. Whereas we see a slightly different picture in whitebark pine, where population pressure is still the most important, but bioclimatic factors are also putatively important. Okay, so since we know that population pressure is important, we can look at where beetles are coming from. And so on the Y or the x-axis here is the mean or the year, and on the y-axis is the mean number of neighbors that are contributing to that propagule pressure estimate. So what we see is that in lodgepole pine stands, beetles are primarily coming from adjacent lodgepole pine. In mixed stands, beetles are primarily coming from adjacent lodgepole, mixed, and some from whitebark. And then in whitebark pine stands, beetles are coming from adjacent lodgepole, mixed, and whitebark. Okay, so the reason that that's important is we have identified that the primary drivers of spread and expansion are population pressure and perhaps bioclimatic factors, but that effect seems to be a little bit more weak. But we also have this second piece of evidence that suggests that beetle movement from lodgepole pine to whitebark pine is more or less unidirectional. Okay, so to conclude this final section, we see that mountain pine beetle infestations are longer in lodgepole pine, which really means that there's probably not enough time for local population transitions for beetles to go from their endemic to their epidemic state within whitebark pine stands. Secondly, areas infested longer have more pine, which gets at this idea that mountain pine beetle are likely depleting stands and then dispersing. Population pressure is the most important driver of mountain pine beetle, which hints at this self-driving growth, and again, doesn't necessarily suggest where beetle populations are or where eruptions are starting, but helps explain some of this movement into whitebark pine, and especially since movement appears to be mostly unidirectional. Expansion seems to be more of a host depletion and spillover than a new outbreaks are occurring in whitebark pine phenomenon. So if we return to this motivating question, we think that the leading cause of whitebark pine mortality from mountain pine beetle is emigration, which has some pretty important ramifications from a management perspective. So since outbreaks don't appear to be self-sustaining in whitebark pine, and since mountain pine beetle seems to come mostly from lodgepole pine, we think that this has pretty good evidence that we should perform more aggressive management of lodgepole pine, and perhaps use this as a reason to thin hazard stands in areas where we have historically not been able to perform any silvicultural treatments. Because ultimately we think that the successful conservation of whitebark pine may entail pretty aggressive management and even outbreak prevention, although we likely have a bit of time to get our act together since outbreaks don't seem to occur all that frequently. Okay, so just to wrap up all four of our stories, we can talk about what we've learned about eruptive insects today. So at the stand level, we've learned that population increases are driven by bioclimatic factors for pulse-driven insects, whereas for threshold-limited insects, we see these density-dependent shifts in reliance on stress material and quality of selected hosts. In terms of their spatiotemporal dynamics, we don't think that there's much spatial aggregation in pulse-driven insects, although we have a few systems in mind where we really want to test this more thoroughly, such as Doug fir beetle. And then in the threshold-limited insects, we see that aggregation is facilitated by pheromone-mediated mass attacks. And at the landscape level, we see that population increases are driven by bioclimatic factors for pulse-driven insects. And similarly for threshold limited, although we also see the strong effect of population pressure. For their spatiotemporal dynamics, we see synchronous activity, which hints at the underlying driver, which is likely bioclimatic factors. Whereas for threshold limited insects, we see this really strong effect of spread once these thresholds have been breached. And while I haven't talked too much about this, we hypothesize that outbreak collapse is mediated by bioclimatic factors in pulse-driven insects, where once conditions become colder or wetter, outbreaks are likely to collapse. Whereas for threshold limited insects, really what ends outbreaks is the number of suitable trees are exhausted across the landscape. And finally, some implications from these results is for pulse-driven insects, perhaps the best way to manage these systems is to use current silvicultural techniques such as thinning to remove stressed and suppressed trees that might be able to harbor these initial buildups of populations. Whereas for threshold limited insects, the outlook is a little bit more bleak. And really what we have to do is prevent outbreaks from occurring in the first place, which is slightly difficult, but which will necessitate us developing better predictions of when and where outbreaks happen. Okay, and with that, I would like to thank some of my co-authors, Brian Akama, Alan Carroll, Claudio Gratton, and Ken Raffa, and I am happy to take questions. Thank you.
Awesome, Mike. That was a very well organized talk. I just wanted to say that. It was really nice to have a bark beetle centric talk. It's been a while. So yeah, it looks like we have time for a couple of questions. So feel free to unmute yourself or type in the chat box.
Hi, Mike. Great talk. It looks like there's a question coming up there, so I'll wait.
Okay.
Looks like there's a question in the chat box from Kristen Waring. Is it really a range expansion of mountain pine beetle in BC? Mountain pine beetle in whitebark pine in the US is not a new thing.
So on the scale of when these outbreaks happen, this is a new thing. So mountain pine beetle outbreaks occur roughly every 60 to 80 years within a stand at much longer intervals. And previously there have not been many records of mountain pine beetle getting into whitebark pine, except in rare cases. So the new part is beetles able to cause large scale mortality to whitebark pine stands, and this is a new phenomenon within the last 20 years, which was when the really big outbreak happened in BC. So yeah, not necessarily new, but new-ish.
Hello there. I'll ask a question. This is Tom Cole. How you doing? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, good. So your recommendations about the threshold limited species preventing outbreaks at all cost. Mm-hmm. I mean, an analogy for me is loblolly pine in eastern Texas or in the southeast, where aggressive sanitation cuts are used to prevent an outbreak at all costs. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering if that's what you're thinking, it might be a management strategy for lodgepole pine, or whether that sort of aggressive, squelch to the outbreak immediately, if possible, might be effective.
Yeah, I think that is a great system to draw inspiration from. I think that is the most cost-effective way of doing it. From reports that I've been hearing in Alberta, their management plans are going to focus on really aggressive sanitation cuts going forward, and identifying beetle spots via helicopter, and then sending in crews to cut immediately. I think another way that this would be feasible is doing it in areas that are close to whitebark pine. So not necessarily preventing outbreaks from happening everywhere, but just preventing either spread or preventing buildups in areas that are, say, I don't know, 5 to 10 kilometers away from high value whitebark pine. We haven't really, this is more of our current idea, and I don't know how we would test this, but we do need to think about it a little bit more to come up with a better management recommendation.
We could take one more question if anyone has one. There is a post-seminar discussion, and I believe Connor posted the link in the chat box, so you could join us there. Tom posted something in the chat box about value of trap catches.
It's actually a question. Hi there again, Mike. So, what is the value of these trap catches other than presence or absence? Are they worth doing?
Yeah, so this is actually something we've been struggling with quite a bit. So in that second story, the one about the spatial aggregation of mountain pine beetle, they also set up trap catches or Lindgren funnel traps in those stands, and they are not correlated with anything whatsoever. So, and those are also unbaited, which are even worse. I think trap catch data, in my mind, are useful when you're trying to test out the effectiveness of chemical mediated silvicultural treatments like push-pull. It's useful in getting a broad idea of presence absence, as you suggested. But other than that, I think they are too responsive to current temperature conditions that they don't give a very good picture of insects' ability to attack trees, or whether they will be a problem or not.
I agree with that. And with that, we've actually ended our seminar. There is a post-seminar discussion. You get the link in the chat box. It's also on the seminar website. And Mike, feel free to, take a little break before signing on. No pressure to rush.
All right. Thanks, everyone.